Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I've talked about adaptations on this channel before in a couple of different formats. I reviewed the One Piece live action episode by episode, with an eye specifically towards how it was adapted, and I think that's a very interesting thing to do. Also, on my blog, I've written some breakdowns of some other adaptations. In all of those analyses, I was particularly interested in the changes in storytelling made to make something work a little bit better in new time constraints or in a different medium. But the release of Dune Part 2 and the Netflix adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender have got me thinking about adaptation from a slightly different angle. And as you may have guessed, that angle is why people choose to adapt something. So let's cover some of the basics very quickly. Particularly with some place like Hollywood, there is a constant demand for content. You have to put something out to make money, and if a thing already has an audience, adapting it to the movie format, or to the live action format, perhaps if you're Disney, lets you put out something new that also has the benefits of being something old. It already has an engaged fan base, and the story is something of a known quantity. Now, particularly with something like a Disney live adaptation, that may not actually save you money, because you're jumping through so many hoops to recreate the sensation of your previous animated version of a movie that, you're just wasting money. But it could be sold as a way to save money as well, because you're not writing the story yourself. Again, that's a bit of a dubious assertion, but it can be a reason why you choose to adapt something rather than creating something new. I think Denis Villeneuve's Dune is also a case study in why something might be adapted. Namely, there is a previous adaptation that is generally accepted as doing very poorly by the original material. David Lynch made a version of Dune in 1984 that is accepted as pretty bad. He condensed the story a huge amount. It's very trippy and weird. The story doesn't necessarily hold together. There's lots of things wrong with it, okay? It's not great. Plenty of people enjoy it for what it is, but as an adaptation, it's very poor. Finally, adapting a work to a new medium can be a way to get that work a new audience. I've already mentioned the One Piece live action once in this video, and I'm going to do it again here. The story of One Piece is already told twice over. It's told in animation, and it's told as the original manga. Did it really need a live action version? Well, that depends on how you define needing an adaptation. One Piece is told in a really great way, in both animation and on the page. But Eiichiro Oda has an art style that is not necessarily pleasing to the eye. It is very cartoony. And I don't say that to denigrate it. I enjoy cartoony art styles, and I believe they are unfairly looked down on, especially in America. What Oda does requires a great deal of skill. And, more importantly, the longer he tells his story, the more people are swept up in his art style and come to accept it as natural. I have felt this myself as someone who has gone away from the manga and come back to it after 6 to 8 months of not reading it. You do kind of feel a bit of disassociation when you come back to that art style for the first time in a while. It's jarring, but the power of it is as it grows on you, it becomes natural, and it helps build the fantasy of the world. But not everyone can make that initial time investment. It is a hurdle to get over. They need to get invested in the characters and the story first. And a live-action adaptation provides that opportunity. I have heard testimony from a number of people who are starting to take an interest in One Piece or coming back to One Piece again after dipping on it because they couldn't get used to the humor or the art style. And they're having an easier time now because they feel like they know the characters that are behind these goofy jokes and crazy illustrations. So while a work may not need an adaptation, having an adaptation to a new medium can bring in new audience. And as long as that adaptation is made with respect and love for the original, I think that can be a good thing. But the case of Avatar is particularly interesting. Let me preface this by saying I don't have a huge investment in Avatar as a story. I didn't grow up with it. I've watched maybe 5 or 6 complete episodes, like the first 4 of the first season, and then others here and there as I was with family and it happened to be on the television. I don't have any real problems with it. It never really grabbed me and pulled me in, and I found it a little bit juvenile, but that's probably to be expected when you first come to it in your late 20s. Of course, plenty of franchises designed for children still grab adults and don't feel particularly juvenile. Nor do I object to juvenile things. Obviously, I read One Piece, and that can be extremely juvenile. My point is, I tried to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it just never really grabbed me. And as I've mentioned before, I have become fairly picky on the kinds of things I invest time in terms of media consumption. So I'm not coming to this with a very strong stance on Avatar. I haven't watched the Netflix live action. I did watch the movie version by Shyamalan, or however you say that, which I found to be kind of meh, but I understand that was, much like Lynch's adaptation of Dune, not a very good adaptation. My intention here is not to defend or condemn the Netflix version of Avatar: The Last Airbender, or really any other live-action adaptation of an animated property, or an adaptation of a TV show to the big screen. None of that is really what I'm looking at here. I am, however, interested in the question, why adapt something from one medium to another? Why go from a radio play to a film? Why go from a movie to a TV show? Why the obsession with turning animated properties into live-action properties? And I think to a certain extent, all of the previous answers are applicable. In particular, with animation to live action, there is a bizarre attitude that live action is more culturally important than animation. Certainly, in the United States, animation has always been seen as something of a novelty product, where the live action cinema is the really important, noteworthy, long-lasting stuff, and that is as it may be. Frankly, I think that's a silly attitude to have, but I don't see that changing anytime soon, and other than taking animation seriously, there's not a lot that I personally can do to change that. But in general, I accept that probably the reason we get so many live-action adaptations of animated properties is because, much like with the versions of Dune, some people feel like an animated version is an inferior product and the story deserves an upgrade to live action. People who attempt an adaptation with that attitude basically always fail, so that doesn't bother me a huge amount. Because yeah, if that's your attitude, you kinda deserve to fail. But I also don't think that's actually the primary impetus. Now, on the studio side, I believe the primary impetus is just content. You need something to put out so you can make money, so you can continue to have a job. And okay, fair enough. He who does not work does not eat. But I think there's also always going to be the challenge. Animation, in particular, is unbounded by physical reality. You can just draw whatever you want. It doesn't matter if the limits of physics or makeup technology or model building techniques allow for that thing to exist. You just put the pen on the page, and then you draw it. That's the power of animation, whether you draw it traditionally or whether you model it in a 3D modeling program. That freedom, that power, has always been a challenge to the abilities of the live-action filmmaker. I talk a lot about the Story Circle on this channel and how it builds tradition and continuity and strength in storytelling. And one of the ways it does that is through challenge. I haven't talked a lot about that so far because it's really not the first thing I think about when I sit down to tell a story. But the Story Circle is about telling a story that continues in the vein of other stories that you already love and enjoy. Now, when you do that, you always want to add your own elements, your own improvements, your own ideas. And most importantly, your own techniques. When it comes to live action, there are more restrictions on what you can do. And so there is always the question, how much can I achieve within the confines of actual physical filming? And these days, filming in conjunction with highly realistic computer effects. As those effects have progressed, as techniques have become more varied and more impressive, I think a lot of people who don't have the artistic talent to be an animator have been asking themselves, can I rise to the challenge of making these visuals work in the real world? And you can say all you want, you know what, maybe animation isn't meant to be in the real world. You can say that, and they're just going to feel more challenged. They're going to say, oh yeah, you say you can't make it work in the real world? Well, maybe I will. And I don't think that's terrible. I think that's actually the kind of attitude that, in the right spirit, in a spirit of friendly competition, in a spirit of elevating the art of storytelling, actually can bring a lot of good to any kind of storytelling. Now, animation and filmmaking are visual storytelling mediums, and the techniques that are involved are much more technical, they have a lot more restrictions, and they are going to hit in very different ways. So getting the exact same storytelling impact from those techniques is going to be exceedingly difficult. But if you can carry forward the spirit and the theme of those techniques into a new medium, you can do a great deal for that medium. And with film being such a visual medium, I can see why these live-action filmmakers are so fixated on recreating those visuals from animation. The challenge there has to be thrilling and inspiring. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a good story at the end of the day. There is more to film storytelling than just the visuals. See my response to Denis Villeneuve in a previous video if you're curious about that. The unfortunate reality is the kinds of work that are very thrilling for storytellers that may push a medium forward aren't always that interesting to audiences. At least not until those techniques are innovated on enough that they can be used effectively in a wide variety of storytelling, and then they are brought into a kind of storytelling that audiences will strongly respond to. So, as I said before, I really am not trying to defend the product we got out of the Netflix adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And I freely concede that there was probably at least a little bad motivation behind it. There being a certain level of looking down your nose at animated projects from the live-action film community. But we know that, at least for a time, the original creators of the series were involved with the project, so I don't think that's entirely what it was. I really believe, in this case, there was an excitement for new techniques of storytelling to be implemented in live action. And I have a lot of sympathy with the people who wanted to do that. Unfortunately, in this case, what they created doesn't really seem to have resonated with the fans of the original. Always a danger of choosing to adapt something rather than make something original. Still, for a long time, as someone who is a fan of the story circle model for storytelling, and yet is not really a fan of most adaptations as I find them, I've been struggling to reconcile these two different points of view, and I think the discussion around Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender has really helped me do some of that. I found it very interesting to mull over, and hopefully you found it interesting to listen to. Let me know if you did down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.